There is a decision you are not making right now. Not because you lack information, not because you've not thought about it. In fact, you have probably thought about it so many times, from so many angles, with so many variations of the same internal conversation, that the thinking itself has become a kind of torment. And still, you are not deciding. Because beneath all the analysis, beneath all the careful weighing of options and consequences and what-ifs, there is something else. Something that does not have a name in most of the frameworks we use to talk about decision-making. Something that sits in the chest rather than the head. That tightens when the question comes close and loosens only when the mind finds a way to postpone, defer, delay. That something is fear, not always a fear you can name. Sometimes it is as specific as, I am afraid this will fail. I am afraid of what people will think. I am afraid of losing what I have. I am afraid of being wrong, of being blamed, of being the person who made the choice that changed everything in a direction that cannot be undone. But sometimes the fear is more fundamental than any specific object. It is the fear that lives at the edge of all serious decisions, the fear of the unknown as such. The irreducible, irremovable fact that every real choice is made in the dark, that certainty is not on offer, that the future does not reveal itself in advance to people who are trying to decide wisely. And so we stay in the loop. We think more. We gather more information. We consult more people. We make lists. We pray for signs that never arrive in the form we were expecting. We postpone the decision until the decision is made for us by the accumulation of events, and then we carry the particular grief of having lived by default rather than by choice. This is one of the most common and most costly forms of suffering in modern life. And it was, in a different, but not entirely different form, precisely what Arjuna was experiencing on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. What Krishna said to him, what he said about clarity, about fear, about the nature of the mind that decides and the self that acts, contains some of the most practically useful guidance on decision-making that any spiritual tradition has ever produced. Today, I want to bring it to you, not as ancient wisdom to be admired from a distance, but as a living, working, practical framework that you can bring into the next decision that is waiting for you. Stay with me. Let us begin by understanding what was actually happening with Arjuna, because his situation is typically described as a moral dilemma, and it was. But underneath the moral dimension was something more fundamental. Arjuna could not decide because he could not think clearly, and he could not think clearly because he was afraid. Not just afraid of the battle, afraid of the consequence of his choice in the deepest sense, afraid that no matter what he did, something essential would be lost, afraid of a future he could not control, organized around outcomes he could not guarantee, requiring him to act in ways that could not be undone. This is the anatomy of decision paralysis. It is not a failure of intelligence. Arjuna was extraordinarily intelligent. It is not a failure of information. He knew the situation fully. It is not even a failure of courage in the conventional sense. He had proven his courage countless times. It is the failure of what Krishna calls buddhi, the discriminating intelligence, the faculty of clear perception that distinguishes what is real from what the fear-driven mind has constructed. The capacity to see through the fog of anxiety and find, at the center of a complex situation, the thread of truth that makes right action possible. And Krishna's entire intervention, the entire Bhagavad Gita, is, at one level, the restoration of that clarity. Not by removing the difficulty of the situation, not by making the choice easier or less consequential, not by eliminating the fear or guaranteeing the outcome, but by restoring to Arjuna the capacity to see clearly from a place that is deeper than the fear. This is what divine mental clarity means in the tradition of the Gita. Not the absence of difficulty, not certainty about outcomes, but the restoration of the seeing faculty, the ability to perceive what is actually true, what is actually required, what is actually the right thing from a depth in the self that the fear cannot reach. The first thing Krishna addresses is what is actually generating the confusion. And his diagnosis is precise. He says, You are suffering from what he calls moha, a Sanskrit word that means delusion, confusion, the fog that descends on a consciousness that has become identified with what it fears losing. Arjuna's mind is generating enormous amounts of activity, scenarios, projections, calculations, arguments for and against every possible course of action. But none of this activity is actually helping him decide, because the activity is not coming from clarity, it is coming from fear. And fear, by its nature, does not produce clarity. It produces more fear, wearing the costume of analysis. This is one of the most important things Krishna teaches about the mind in relation to decision-making. And it is something that modern psychology has only recently begun to understand in its own language. The quality of your thinking depends entirely on the state you are thinking from. If you are thinking from fear, from a contracted, defended, threat response state, your thinking will be fear-shaped, regardless of how sophisticated the analysis appears. You will notice risks more than opportunities. You will weight losses more heavily than gains. You will generate more reasons to avoid action than to take it. And all of this will feel like careful, rational deliberation, even as it circles the same ground endlessly without arriving anywhere. If you are thinking from clarity, from a relatively open, stable, grounded state, the same information produces different conclusions. Not because the facts have changed, but because the lens through which they are perceived has changed. This is why Krishna does not begin by helping Arjuna analyze his options. He begins by addressing the state Arjuna is in. By restoring, through teaching, through revelation, through the gradual dismantling of the fear-driven worldview, the conditions in which clear seeing is possible, the decision will come. But first, the seer must be restored. There is a word Krishna uses throughout the Gita that is worth holding carefully: viveka. It is usually translated as discernment or discrimination. The capacity to distinguish between what is real and what is merely apparent, between what is permanent and what is temporary, between what the self actually is and what it has mistaken itself for. And viveka is, at its core, the foundation of fearless decision-making. Because most of the fear that paralyzes us in decision-making is not fear of the actual consequences. It is fear attached to a misidentification. Fear generated by a self that has located its entire worth, its entire security, its entire sense of who it is in outcomes that are inherently uncertain. When you believe that your value as a person depends on whether this decision succeeds, the decision carries an impossible weight. It is no longer just a choice. It is a verdict on your worth, and no one can think clearly under those conditions. When you believe that a specific outcome is necessary for your life to be acceptable, that this relationship, this career, this path is the only path, then the fear of choosing wrongly becomes existential. The stakes are not just high, they feel absolute. Viveka is the practice of seeing through these, of recognizing that the self which is doing the choosing is not actually identical with any outcome, that your worth is not contingent on the success of your decisions, that the awareness in which the choice is being made is not diminished by any result the choice produces. This does not mean the outcomes do not matter. They do. It means that you are not the outcome. And when you begin to genuinely, experientially know this, not just as an idea, but as a felt reality, the quality of your decision-making changes fundamentally. You can see more clearly. Because you are not defending yourself through the seeing, Krishna offers Arjuna a framework for right decision-making that I want to walk through carefully, because it is both more ancient and more precise than most modern frameworks for navigating uncertainty. The first element is what Krishna calls sthita prajna, steady wisdom, the capacity to make decisions from a place of inner stability that is not destabilized by the emotional weather of the moment. He describes the person of steady wisdom as someone who does not rejoice when pleasant things happen or grieve when unpleasant things happen, not because they have become emotionally flat or indifferent, but because they have found a ground in themselves that the fluctuations of circumstance cannot move. From this ground, clarity is naturally available, not because the situation has become simpler, but because the one perceiving the situation is no longer being moved like a boat on stormy water. The boat has found its anchor. And here is the practical implication. The decisions that feel most impossibly difficult, the ones we circle for months, the ones that generate the most mental noise, are almost always decisions we are trying to make from a state of inner turbulence. From fear, from grief, from urgency, from the desperate pressure of feeling that something essential depends on choosing correctly right now. And the single most valuable thing you can do in the face of a difficult decision is not to think more about the decision. It is to restore, even partially, even briefly, the quality of inner steadiness from which clear perception becomes possible. This is not delay. It is not avoidance. It is the recognition that the quality of the decision depends on the quality of the consciousness making it, and that investing time in restoring that consciousness is not wasted time. It is perhaps the most efficient thing you can do. The second element of Krishna's framework is detachment from outcomes, and I want to address this very specifically in the context of decision making, because it is almost universally misunderstood. When people hear that they should be detached from outcomes, the immediate objection is, but I have to care about outcomes. Decisions have consequences. The whole point of deciding carefully is to produce better outcomes. How can I make good decisions if I am indifferent to what they produce? This objection is correct, and it is based on a misreading of what Krishna means. He does not say, do not care what happens. He says, do not make the outcome the condition of your inner peace. Do not let the anticipated result be the lens through which you evaluate the choice before it has been made. And this distinction is enormously practical. When you are trying to make a decision primarily by projecting the desired outcome and working backward to the action that produces it, you introduce a specific kind of distortion. You unconsciously favor the option that feels like it will produce the outcome you want, not necessarily the option that is actually right, or wisest, or most aligned with your deepest values. The fear-driven mind is extraordinarily skilled at constructing rationales for the choice that protects the ego, at generating analysis that supports the conclusion the anxious self most wants to reach. And it is equally skilled at generating objections to the choices that, at a deeper level, it already knows are right, but is afraid of. Detachment from outcomes is not indifference. It is the practice of removing this distorting lens, of asking not which option most reliably delivers the result I want, but which option is most aligned with what I know to be true, what I value most deeply, what I would choose if I were fully free of fear. This is a different kind of clarity, and it produces a different quality of decision, one that may not always be comfortable, but that has a coherence and an integrity that the fear-driven analysis rarely achieves. I want to pause here for a moment, because what I am describing can sound, in the abstract, more accessible than it feels in actual practice. And I want to be honest about that. The mind that is consumed by fear does not simply become clear because someone tells it that clarity is available from a deeper place. The ego that has staked its security on a particular outcome does not simply release that attachment because it understands intellectually that attachment is a source of distortion. This is why Krishna does not just explain a framework to Arjuna. He takes him through a process, a long, layered, sometimes demanding process of teaching and revelation and direct pointing, designed not just to change what Arjuna thinks, but to change the state from which he is thinking. What that process looks like translated into the practice of an ordinary life, involves several concrete things. It involves coming to stillness before attempting the decision, not the forced stillness of a mind that has been told to be quiet, but the genuine stillness that comes from giving the nervous system a break from the constant stimulation of analysis, from breathing, from letting the urgency, however real it feels, settle even slightly before the next round of deliberation begins. It involves inquiry, the honest, patient practice of asking, what am I actually afraid of here? Not what do I tell myself I am afraid of, but what is the real fear beneath the analysis? What is the self actually trying to protect? What loss is the ego most unable to accept? Because naming the fear clearly, without judgment, has the immediate effect of creating a small but crucial distance between you and the fear. You are no longer the fear. You are the one who can see it. It involves what some traditions call discernment, and what Krishna might call listening to buddhi, the higher intelligence. That quality of knowing that is not the result of more thinking, but of quieter, deeper attention. The sense of rightness that sometimes appears when the analytical mind finally exhausts itself. The recognition of something true that does not arrive through argument, but through a form of perception that is older and quieter than the surface of the mind. This is available, not always, not easily, but with practice and with patience, increasingly. There is another teaching from the Gita that I believe is among the most practically important for decision-making, and it is one that receives far less attention than it deserves. Krishna talks about the three qualities, the three gunas, that characterize all of nature and all of human action: tamas, rajas, and sattva. And he applies this framework not just to action, but to knowledge, to understanding, and crucially, to the nature of decision-making itself. He says, Sattvic knowledge sees the one imperishable reality in all diverse things. It sees the unity beneath the multiplicity. It perceives what is essential rather than becoming lost in the endless particular details of a complex situation. Rajasic knowledge, on the other hand, sees each thing as separate and distinct. It is absorbed in the particulars, the variations, the infinite complexity of the surface. It is not wrong that particulars are real, but it loses the thread of what is essential. And in decision-making, this manifests as the experience of being overwhelmed by variables, of generating more and more information that does not clarify, only complicates, of analysis paralysis in its most characteristic form. And tamasic knowledge is even more contracted. It clings to one partial view as though it were the whole. It is the rigidity of a mind that has already decided and is looking only for confirmation. The practice of sattvic decision-making is the practice of stepping back from the variables without ignoring them to find the thread of what is essential, to ask, beneath all the complexity, what is actually true here? What is the core of what I value? What does this decision look like when I remove the layers of fear and ego and projected outcome and see it from the perspective of my deepest self? This is not always easy to find, but it is always there. And the sattvic intelligence has a quality that is recognizable once you know what to look for. It is quiet rather than loud, steady rather than urgent, clear rather than clever. It does not argue with itself. It simply knows. Krishna says something in the Gita that I want to dwell with for a full moment because it goes to the heart of fearless decision-making. He says, the person who has achieved clarity, the person of steady wisdom, is one who performs necessary action without confusion, knowing what ought to be done and what ought not to be done. Knowing what ought to be done. This is not certainty about outcomes. It is certainty about rightness, about alignment, about the kind of deep congruence between the action and the values that makes the action feel at the core level, true, regardless of what it produces. And this distinction is everything. Because most of us have been trained to evaluate decisions primarily by their anticipated outcomes. Will this succeed? Will this be rewarded? Will this produce the result I am hoping for? And because outcomes are genuinely uncertain, this framework of evaluation generates endless anxiety. There is no stable ground to stand on when the ground is the future, which does not yet exist. But when the evaluation shifts from outcome to alignment, from what will this produce to what is this in alignment with, something changes. Because alignment is something you can know now. You do not have to wait for the future to reveal it. You can perceive it with sufficient stillness and honest self-inquiry in the present moment. Is this action aligned with what I actually value? Is it aligned with my deepest understanding of who I am and what I am here to do? Is it aligned with the kind of person I am choosing to be, regardless of whether the world rewards that choice? When those questions can be answered with a quiet yes, even if the outcome remains uncertain, even if the fear is still present, even if everything around the decision remains complex and unresolved, something in the consciousness shifts. The decision becomes possible because the ground it is standing on is not the uncertain future. It is the known present, the clear, immediate, accessible reality of what you actually value and who you actually are. This is what Krishna means by acting without confusion. Not acting without difficulty, but acting from a place that is coherent, that knows itself well enough to choose, even in the dark. I want to speak now about something that lives in the gap between the teaching and the practice, the place where most people find themselves when they try to apply what the Gita says to an actual, difficult, consequential decision. It is the problem of doubt, not the preliminary doubt that precedes clarity, but the doubt that arrives after, the second guessing, the morning after a decision has been made, when the mind begins its revisionary work, constructing all the reasons the choice might have been wrong, all the alternative paths that might have been better, all the evidence that the decision was driven by fear or ego or wishful thinking rather than genuine clarity. This doubt is one of the most painful experiences in the inner life of a person who is trying to decide consciously, because it takes the one thing you worked so hard to establish, the sense of rightness, the alignment, the quiet knowing, and begins to dissolve it. Krishna addresses this directly. He talks about the importance of what he calls vyavasayatmika buddhi, the one-pointed, resolved intelligence, the quality of mind that, having made a genuine, aligned decision, remains committed to it in the face of the inevitable return of doubt. This is not stubbornness. It is not the refusal to learn from new information or to adapt when circumstances genuinely change. It is the recognition that the mind, left to its own devices, will always generate doubt after a genuine decision. That this is not new information, it is the fear returning in a different form. The practice, after a genuine decision has been made, is to hold it, not rigidly, not blindly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows the ground they were standing on when they chose, who trusts the clarity that was available then, even in the moments when the current state of mind tries to undermine it. This is a form of faith. Not faith in a particular outcome, but faith in the knowing that was available in the moment of genuine clarity. Trust in the intelligence that operates from a deeper place than the surface of the mind. And that trust, practiced consistently, returned to when doubt arrives, renewed as many times as necessary, is itself a form of the steady wisdom that Krishna calls the mark of the liberated mind. There is one more teaching that I believe is essential for fearless decision-making, and it is the one that perhaps most completely frees the decision from the grip of fear. It is the teaching of surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, not the surrender of someone who has given up, who has decided it does not matter, who has contracted out of genuine engagement with their own life. The surrender that Krishna describes in the 18th chapter, at the culmination of the entire Gita, is something entirely different. It is the surrender of the ego's claim to be the ultimate author of outcomes. The release of the belief that the quality of your life depends entirely on whether you choose correctly. He says, abandon all varieties of Dharma and simply surrender unto me. Do not fear. Do not fear. This is the deepest answer to the fear that drives decision paralysis. Not, there is nothing to fear, because the outcome will definitely be good. But there is nothing to fear because you are held by something that is not dependent on the outcome. The love and the presence and the support that Krishna promises, the carrying of what you cannot carry, the preservation of what you need preserved, these are not contingent on choosing correctly. They are not rewards for good decisions. They are the unconditional ground beneath all of it. Present regardless of what you choose. Present even if you choose wrongly. Present even in the consequences of the choice, whatever they turn out to be. And when this lands, when it is not just an idea, but a felt reality, the quality of decision-making changes completely, because you are no longer deciding from a place of desperate necessity. You are no longer choosing as though the entire value of your existence depends on getting this right. You are choosing from a place that is held, that is loved, that cannot ultimately be diminished by any result that the choice produces. And from that place, ironically, the decisions become clearer, more aligned, more genuinely free, because fear has loosened its grip even slightly. And in the space where fear was, something else becomes available. The quiet, steady, ancient intelligence of a self that knows what it is and what it values and how it wants to move through the world. That intelligence has always been there. Fear has been covering it. Let the fear be seen. Let it be named. Let it be acknowledged as real and human and understandable. And then, beneath it, find the stillness. Find the ground. Find the part of you that knows. It has the answer you have been looking for. You came to this teaching with a decision, or the memory of a decision, or the anticipation of one that is coming. And I do not know what that decision is. I do not know the specific complexity of your situation, the specific shape of your fear, the specific form of the clarity you have been searching for. But I know this: you have the capacity to make this decision well. Not perfectly, the perfect decision does not exist, and chasing it is itself a form of the fear that prevents action. But well, from a place of genuine alignment, genuine honesty, genuine contact with what you most deeply value, the Gita does not promise you that your decisions will always produce the outcomes you were hoping for. Krishna himself is explicit about this. The fruits of action are not yours to control, but it does promise something else, something that, in the long run, matters more. It promises that the quality of the consciousness you bring to your decisions, the steadiness, the clarity, the genuine alignment with what is true and right, will transform not just the decisions, but the life that is built from them, will produce, over time, the kind of life that even when it is hard, even when it does not go according to plan, has a coherence and a dignity and an alignment with the deepest self that makes it genuinely, durably worth living. This is what fearless decision-making produces. Not a life free from difficulty, but a life free from the particular suffering of having lived by default, having let fear choose, having arrived at the end of the story, having never fully shown up as the author. Show up, choose, from the ground of who you actually are. The clarity you need is not in more information, more analysis, more thinking. It is in the quiet at the center of you that the fear has been drowning out. Go there. It is waiting, and it already knows. If this teaching offered you something real, a thread of clarity, a moment of genuine recognition, something that shifted even slightly the way you are holding the decision in front of you, I want to ask you to carry it forward. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a like on this video. Not as an obligation, but as a choice, an act of alignment with the community of people who are choosing to move through their lives with more consciousness, more honesty, and more genuine contact with their own deepest knowing. That is the work we are doing here together. And you being here, listening this carefully, is already part of it. Until next time, come to stillness, find the ground, and trust the part of you that already knows the way.